Hello, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to The Green Room, a collaboration between Washtenaw County and Ann Arbor's Community Television Network. Today, our guest is Jennifer Thien, a science coordinator with the Monarch Joint Venture, which is a partnership of federal and state agencies, non-governmental organizations, businesses, and academic programs working together to protect the monarch migration across the United States. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Barbara. Thanks for having me.
So this is going to be a whirlwind tour of threats to monarchs and what we can do about it. But before we launch into our conversation, do you mind if I show a very brief video that I found on the Monarch Joint Venture website that overviews your program?
That's great.
The monarch butterfly, one of nature's most stunning pollinators. In the fall, monarchs make the strenuous journey south to wintering grounds in central Mexico or along the California coast. And when spring approaches, it's time to begin another journey, returning north in search of milkweed to lay their eggs. For 2 weeks, monarch caterpillars only eat milkweed. This plant provides nutrition and a toxic boost that protects them from predators. Then, after one final shedding of its caterpillar skin, the butterfly begins to transform inside the chrysalis. Its brilliant wings fully developed, finally, a butterfly emerges. Adult monarchs search the landscape for milkweeds, wildflowers, and a mate. Each fall, the special migratory generation makes the journey to their wintering grounds where they await the cycle to begin again in the spring. Long abundant in North America, both eastern and western monarch populations have reached record low numbers, down by more than 90% from historic counts. Among many factors, habitat loss and climate change threaten monarchs, raising concern that the great monarch migration may be lost. The Monarch Joint Venture, through powerful partnerships, is the leading entity for monarch conservation in the United States. MJV is the maestro of an orchestra of talented players working on a single song to save a species and its habitat. We work to protect monarchs and their migration by collaborating with our partners to deliver the best habitat conservation, education, and science across the United States. And what's good for monarchs protects other vital pollinators. To save monarchs, we need to increase their populations by planting more than 1 billion stems of milkweed within millions of acres of nectar-rich habitat. The MJV is mobilizing individuals and organizations across North America, but we need your help. Please join us. Your contribution is the best chance we have to protect the breathtaking journey of the monarch butterfly from every corner of the United States for generations to come.
All right, so do I have this right? The video says that there are 90% reductions in the numbers. That's really bad. Are we into, are they on the endangered species list yet?
Not at this time. They kind of hit a very low point around 2014 and were proposed to be listed on the Endangered Species Act. It took several years, and we just found out last year that they are a candidate species to be on the endangered species list. So in 2024, there will be another assessment by the Fish and Wildlife Service to see if monarchs warrant being listed. So they, and along with our organization and many others, are gathering as much information as we can about the trajectory that they're on, because you're right, that's a huge loss, and they statistically are potentially in danger of becoming extinct, or that migration may become extinct.
And the video says we need to plant 1 billion milkweed stems. That's a lot of milkweed. And I live in a small lot in the city. What kind of milkweeds could I grow here?
Depends on your geography. One of the most common milkweed species in the eastern US is, the common name is common milkweed. It's Asclepias syriaca, and that's relatively easy to find and grow. It's often what we see along our roadsides. Another great one is swamp milkweed. If you're in a wetter area, swamp milkweed is I like the scent of it, a nice floral scent and purple species that grows in wetter areas.
In my yard, I've also tried butterfly milkweed. Is that right?
Yeah, butterfly weed. That's a wonderful one. I've had some in the last home I lived in, and it was just lovely to see that come up. That's great for drier areas.
So the ordinance in the Ann Arbor, I looked it up. It says on private property outside of a cultivated bed or planned natural landscape, no vegetation shall be permitted at a height greater than 12 inches. And I know a lot of these grow greater than 12 inches, and planned is kind of a subjective term. How do we let our neighbors know that what we're doing is actually planned?
Yes, absolutely. I love the idea, the concept of habitat in our yards, and that's something that we can do. And there's a couple different ways to put signage out on your yards. And so one might be adding some decoration to make it maybe look visually like it's planned. There are signs from organizations like Monarch Watch that has a monarch way station that tells people you're providing nectar or habitat for monarchs. There are also some habitat signage available from Monarch Joint Venture or the National Wildlife Foundation, who have different signage options for wildlife habitat in urban areas or pollinator habitat more generally.
And along roadways, I've seen in the country a lot of milkweed growing along roadways. Could we be doing that more in more urban areas as well, do you think?
It's possible. I think that roadways have a lot of potential to have monarch habitat. They can be very, very productive habitat. And so adding milkweed to roadsides is actually a strategy that's being considered by a lot of monarch and pollinator conservation organizations to make sure that, there's a huge area. If you add it all up, there's a huge area of roadside that could be impacted. And so we're also promoting the correct strategies to manage that. So in order to keep the roadside safe and not overgrown, they might have to be mowed or invasive species sprayed. And Monarch Joint Venture has some guidance on how and when to do that, which can help improve that habitat.
Yeah, because I guess it would be almost like a population sink if you were to encourage them to lay their eggs and then you mow it before they can hatch out and fly away. So what would be the good time of year in, for instance, the Ann Arbor area for mowing? I mean, when is it safe that the monarchs have hatched and flown away?
For the Ann Arbor area, and you can find a nice handout on the Monarch Joint Venture website. Generally, it's best to maybe avoid mowing during the time when they are breeding. So that might be avoiding kind of the April to October period. But if you need to do a mid-season mow, and there are certainly benefits to a mid-season mow, that might be best timed around early July.
Okay. And also agricultural fields. There's so much to talk about there, but just to summarize, I've read that there's something like 200 million acres of land that have been devoted to corn and soy. I guess the demand is exploding for ethanol and livestock feed. We have so much meat and dairy consumption in the US. And then there's the increasing demand for compostable products. And all that corn and soy, I guess something like 90% is grown with herbicide resistant GMOs. So can you explain what the danger to monarchs are with widespread use of that?
Yeah, it's actually kind of an indirect effect with regard to some of these chemicals. First thing might be to understand, how do genetically modified crops relate to monarch habitat in general? It's because historically there was a lot of milkweed and other weedy species that grew within our crop rows, and that might be much to a farmer's dismay. But research shows that those monarchs were using that habitat that was growing in the fields. So now that we've transitioned to, like you said, around like 90% of our crop fields are herbicide tolerant, that means that someone can spray a certain herbicide over the entire field. The corn or soy continues to grow, it's not affected. but all the other weedy species, including milkweed, will die. So monarchs their populations have been hit pretty hard by that transition. Research suggests that this loss of milkweed has a negative impact on their populations, but that use has kind of plateaued. And so while there might be some movement to swing the pendulum in the other direction, something that a different approach is, and maybe more productive for all parties, is to shift toward targeting what are considered marginal ag lands or marginal acreage, where it is actually costing the farmer more to put crops in with the seed and the fertilizer, and they're not very productive area. It costs more than they receive selling that crop. And so there's a relatively new technique called precision agriculture. And we work with some of our partners on that can target those specific areas and try to take those unproductive areas out of production, put them back into productive monarch and pollinator habitat. And it's really a win-win situation.
And how about hedgerows, even within the areas that they have to plant their corn and soy?
Yeah, that's great. Hedgerows and other items like prairie strips can be put within a field, and those serve a couple purposes. Oftentimes a main purpose is to improve water quality and slow the water from running off and keep some sediment soil on the agricultural land, and they can be very productive habitat as well. So those are great uses. There are also federal and certain state resources to help agricultural producers put those in place.
It makes me think about wanting to eat more organic and or waste less food, because Americans, I guess, waste something like 40% of our food. And if we have all these impacts, maybe if we bought what we need and ate what we bought, we would have fewer impacts in an indirect way.
Absolutely, that is a great point, Barbara.
So what about the threats to the wintering grounds in Mexico? I know there's this biosphere preserve that's trying to protect the pine trees down there. What's that one called?
Yeah, that's the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. And that was created a couple decades ago to protect the wintering grounds, the overwintering grounds. And so that's been very helpful in protecting the important oyamel fir trees, which are like those pine trees, those evergreens where the monarchs overwinter.
Mm-hmm. And having tourists go down to visit during the winter to see the monarchs is good, because there's a lot of pressure on those trees, right? Isn't there like avocado farming and things that they really want to expand?
Yeah, there are certainly pressures in the area. The tourism is a benefit, and there are local communities that are involved in making sure that that's performed in a sustainable way. Avocado production, I can acknowledge that there's some deforestation associated with the avocado production. Some recent research does suggest that most of the deforestation associated with avocados is actually a little further west and at lower elevations than the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. So it's just maybe important, back to your point about working within our entire food network to support, sustainable systems and advocating for those type of sustainable systems that involve the whole community.
So then there's climate change, which I know is huge. We've got all the droughts and the extreme weather, so many threats to our fragile monarch migration. How about with its timing? Does climate change mess up the timing for the monarchs?
It may, and there's some recent work out of the eastern US that shows that monarchs are migrating about 2 weeks later than they were 30 years ago. And so that's likely due to changes in the climate.
And having the plants blooming when they get there is important too, right? Because not only do they need the milkweed there, and they also need the nectar plants to fuel their flights, right?
Yes, there could be concern about the timing of that migration. So if they're shifting because the temperatures are warming, they might be arriving in areas maybe before the nectar resources are available, or the milkweed themselves. And there's also some research that shows that monarchs are more likely to make it to Mexico to survive that whole flight when the sun is at a certain angle. So basically at a certain time of the year and not necessarily temperature. So if monarchs are shifting their migration based on the temperature, but it's more successful when they navigate at certain times of the year, we see this kind of conflict and potentially lower success of the fall migration if we have that mismatch of the timing and the temperature.
Wow. So we've been talking specifically about monarchs, but on your website, you've got a blog called More Than Monarchs. What's the significance of that title?
Yeah, it is to really honor everything that's related to monarchs and their habitat that is well beyond monarchs themselves. So a lot of our partners are not just focused on the monarch, but they're working within this whole kind of vegetative community that supports a variety of pollinators, native bees, rare plants, whole rare systems in themselves. And so we like to devote our blog to that particular blog so that we can really give a shout out to people who are working with monarchs in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And there's co-benefits to a lot of different species. As you mentioned, I saw you had a collaboration with Pheasants Forever.
Yeah, they are an organization that works really in similar systems that people who work in monarch conservation do. So we're working to promote grassland habitat, sustainable, prairies that have high quality nectar resources and habitat available for pheasants or monarchs or other flora and fauna that use those habitats. So we work with them on a couple endeavors, including the Miles for Monarchs campaign, which is a way to raise funds for local prairie habitat restoration. And you can search either of our organization's websites to find out more about that campaign.
So is that like people run and then?
Yeah, it is. You get a group of people together and can register, and then either you get to decide, you can track your miles, or you can kayak or hike or do all kinds of activities, and then raise funds that both can stay locally. So you get to kind of select what organization you're going to support locally or what habitat project. And then some of those funds also go to support monarch and pheasant habitat at the national level.
Mm-hmm. So the way the benefits can transfer to other species, is that kind of what you mean by a flagship species? I've heard monarchs referred to that way. That, what can you explain that concept?
Yeah, we see monarchs as a flagship species because they are so familiar and beautiful and really capture a wide audience. And so it enables children and adults to develop strong connections with monarchs. It's sort of a gateway insect, some people also call it, because it's really an icon of not just prairie habitat, but like you said, we can plant milkweed in our yards. We can see monarchs in our yards and in habitats where really we find it surprising and yet encouraging to see that and have that connection with the monarchs. And so in that way, monarch is a flagship for conservation on a variety of levels.
And there's co-benefits to the human species as well. Like for instance, with water quality, what's the connection between planting native plants and water quality?
Native plants tend to have deeper roots. If we're talking about native prairie plants, which can, hold the soil in place better. They can have really good impact on water quality in terms of reducing runoff. And so back to where we were talking about putting prairie strips, maybe within an agricultural field, that's one way that we can use native plants to improve water quality. So there are certainly ways that we can benefit from putting in more monarch habitat. Another one might be carbon sequestration, because there's so much biomass in their roots that they're sequestering a lot of carbon from our atmosphere. So that's yet another way that we can benefit.
Lots of win-wins.
Yes, I think so.
Mm-hmm. So we're almost out of time. Let's just throw out some bullets of different things that we have mentioned that people can do. Like they can plant milkweed, plant nectar plants. What else?
Yeah, if you're in a community where you have those type of ordinances that you mentioned, Barbara, where you can't have plants growing beyond a certain height or something, that might be something that you locally can work to change. We've also had a lot of people involved in our community science programs who have collected information when monarchs are in their area, how well they're growing and reproducing. So they're on the Monarch Joint Venture website has a whole list of community science programs you can get involved in. And then some of the groups that we talked about already. So Wild Ones groups, Master Gardener groups, local naturalist groups. Those are great groups to get connected with. And that can be anything from sharing seeds, helping each other grow native plants, to participating in outreach and education opportunities, share your knowledge, share your enthusiasm, or perhaps even get out to a park and help literally with the restoration of a landscape.
Mhm. I think we mentioned contacting road commissions and encouraging them not to mow the roadways before the.
Yeah, that's a great thought. We do on our website have a mowing for monarchs handout, and I'd recommend or encourage you to find that and share that with your mowing commission. Let them know that that's based in research. It has a suggested window. Also keeping in mind that there are a lot of other things that they're balancing, whether it's
Sure.
grass birds or
Sure.
invasive species. And so this is a great resource that has considered all of that.
Mhm. And supporting climate change legislation, supporting efforts to conserve natural landscapes. I mean, there's so many things that you've touched on that people could focus on. And then there's, financial contributions, that video that we showed how you can contribute to the Monarch Joint Venture. So anything else that you want to throw out there?
I think that sums it up. We've got the Miles for Monarchs campaign. And if you're particularly interested in helping in the overwintering ground, the Monarch Butterfly Fund is partner of MJV. I recommend you looking into that. And they do a lot of work on the overwintering grounds in Mexico.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Jennifer. It's been really interesting.
It's been wonderful to share all this information with you, Barbara.
So to watch this and all our Green Room shows, you can go to washtenaw.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.